Okay, hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is the second video I'm doing ever and of this year, and I think it's gonna be a fun one. So my first video was my best books of 2024, the best books that I read in 2024, and you might be able to guess that this video is going to be the worst books that I read in 2024. As always, disclaimer before I get started, if any of these books are your favorite books, then I'm sorry. I am coming at it trying to be genuine. Like, I'm not just hating on anyone who loves these books and reads them or enjoyed them or thought they were genuinely good. These are just my own opinions, and I'm going to try to express them in a pretty calm and concise and measured way. I'm not just going to say these books are terrible and I hate them. I'm going to explain where I thought they didn't work, and if I thought they did something good, then maybe I'll say that as well. And also, my list is split into two parts. It is the books that I found the worst and also the books that I found the most disappointing. So books that I found the worst are books that I just straight up thought were badly written, badly executed in some way, and I didn't enjoy them. Whereas the books on my most disappointing section are books that, like, maybe I had really high expectations for them and they just didn't live up to those expectations, or I thought they did some things well but some things were executed poorly, and so I just couldn't enjoy them. And the books in the most disappointing section are all books that I would read more stuff from those authors or continuations of those books, even if they were made into series, because a lot of them are just books that, like, the potential was there but the execution was just lacking. But I thought it would be fun to talk about those books too, so let's get started. And one more disclaimer before I start. I'm sorry about, like, the blinds, the light coming through the blinds onto me. I can't fix it. I've tried everything. I've tried lowering them completely. I've tried closing them completely. I've tried opening them completely. It's just, there's gonna be light on me. It's not on my face, so I don't think it's gonna be super annoying. If it is, I'm very sorry. Yell at me in the comments and I won't ever film at this time of day ever again. But, like, I have to be in front of my windows because my apartment's old and doesn't have overhead lighting, so it gets really dark in here. So I have to be in front of my windows during the day, and I'm still trying to figure out what time of day is best for that. And I guess I'm not going to film at this time of day anymore, but I hope it's not too distracting. Another disclaimer is that I'm not going to be doing, like, plot summaries for these. I did them for my best books videos, but that's because those are books that either I thought were going to be niche or not well known, or books that, like, I really want you to be excited by and go out and read. Whereas the books on this list, first of all, a lot of them are really popular or well known at least, so I don't think you need me to tell you what they're about. And also, I don't really care if you read these books. I don't really want you to read these books, so I'm not going to be, like, marketing them to you. But if there is a book and you just don't know what it is, what I'm talking about, Google it, or I'll try to give, like, very brief summaries, but that's it. And also, I'll try to be non-spoilery, but if I'm getting really explicitly spoilery, I'll tell you. There's all the disclaimers out of the way. Let's get started. So we're starting with my most disappointing books. We're gonna work our way up, and these are in vague order from least disappointing to most disappointing, although there's always, like I said in my best books video, all of these can probably switch around and still be in an accurate order. So let's get started. The first book is going to be A Botanical Daughter by Noah Medlock. This was published in 2024. This book is basically like a Victorian gay retelling of Frankenstein, but they make, like, a plant daughter instead of an adult man made out of corpses. I would read more from this author because I really thought this had a lot of potential. Like, that concept is so fun. The vibes, like, especially at first, were reminding me a lot of, like, a mixture between Reanimator and Interview with the Vampire and Little Shop of Horrors, because it has, like, dubious gay scientists, baby trapping, and sentient cannibal plants, which are all things that I love. And I love the, like, central concept of this book, and they live in a greenhouse, which I thought was so fun. It was a very fun environment, very richly sketched out world that they live in, like the setting around them. But sadly, I just didn't think the plot and the characters really came together in this one for me. It starts off really strong, and then it kind of just, like, trips and fumbles its way towards the ending, towards the climax. This book goes in a direction you don't expect, but not because there's, like, some great twist. It goes in a direction you don't expect because a lot of the stuff that happens in this book feels more like plot convenience, or like stuff that the author just needed to happen for this plot that they wanted to set up, as opposed to, like, feeling naturally driven by the characters and their character development and, like, the actual actions going on in the story. Similar to that, I didn't ever feel like the either relationship between the main couple or between them and, like, their new daughter was ever like well developed or well done. It just felt like they all just switched rapidly between what they felt about each other when the plot demanded it. Like, the two main characters go from either being totally in love and wanting to start a family to hating each other and only sticking together out of convenience. Like, they go back and forth between that at the snap of a finger. And then also the way they feel about their daughter Chloe, the plant daughter they've created, also goes back and forth so rapidly. One minute they think she's, you know, their genuine daughter that they love, and the next minute she's an unholy abomination or like just a science project. And it never felt like those feelings were being spurred on by something like an emotional breakdown or like something that Chloe did or something that the other characters do. It always just felt like this is what the author needs this character to think right now to make the actions of the plot make sense, and it just didn't come together for me. I couldn't even enjoy the weird plant lesbians in this, which normally would be right up my alley, because despite Jenny saying that Chloe was like becoming an adult, like gaining adult-like sentience, she never acted more like anything more than like a toddler, so that was just really uncomfortable for me. Like, she doesn't have the cognition to be like fucking this other lady, like the adult woman. Like, it was just bad for me. I didn't enjoy it. I mean, I think you'll enjoy this if you like really weird stuff, but again, I like really weird stuff too, and the plot just like did not come together for me. But like I said, I would read more from this author in the future. I didn't hate this one. I was just kind of disappointed by it because I thought the concept and the beginning were so great, and then I just kind of lost steam. Okay, number 2 on my most disappointing list is This Ravenous Fate by Hayley Dennings. This was also published in 2024. I read a lot of lesbian vampire books in 2024. I was like doing a project where I reread Carmilla and read a bunch of lesbian vampire fiction. I went into this one with a very open mind, open heart, because this is a YA debut novel, and like, listen, I don't read YA, it's just not my particular genre, and I also know that like with a debut novel, like, you need to give some grace, and that's what I went into this novel really trying to do. And I had a pretty fun time with it. Like, I enjoyed this novel, but there are still some like I don't know, this just really needed more editing. Like, almost all of the problems I had with this novel were things that could be fixed with like 1 or 2 more rounds of editing. So I would again read more from this author, and I will probably read the sequel to this book, but like, I really hope that they just get another set of eyes on this manuscript multiple times, like rewriting and revising and copy editing on a line level, because like, there was just so much technically wrong with this book, and technically as in like the technical sense, like on a craft level. There was a lot of weird things about this book. Let me go through them. So the structure of this book is really weird. It's broken up into acts that are like separated by pages, like Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, but the acts don't correlate to anything going on in the actual story. It's not like it's rising action, climax, falling action. Like, it just makes no sense, like, why this book is divided into the acts it's divided into, and the names of the acts are named, but those don't make any sense either. So I'm like, what's with the names here? What's with the acts? And then also the plot of this is just overly convoluted in a way that doesn't lend itself to the way the plot is delivered in this book. Like, it's supposed to be a murder mystery, but they're supposed to be like investigating this murder, but they do like zero investigating, and it's so obvious from the beginning who's behind it, and then they just kind of stumble into who is doing it at the very end of the story. Like, the climax of this book is so confusing, despite the fact that it consists of a bunch of characters standing around explaining the plot of the book to each other, like, and then I did this and that's why this happened, and yet I still had no idea what was going on. I still have to reread this climax multiple times to try to figure out just like physically what happened and why the characters were doing the things that they did. And I just feel like the plot is really weirdly paced. I think it needed to be more spread out evenly over the course of the novel, and maybe revised even, so that like I said, the characters don't just have to stand around during the climax explaining the events of the novel to the reader, because otherwise they would make zero sense. And then the writing itself was just really inconsistent. Like, sometimes the writing style would be really good and really like rich and well done on a craft level, and then every so often you would just get a sentence that would just be so awkwardly phrased and so weird that it would just pull me right out of the book. I'd be like, and the dialogue was also, again, pretty flat. Like, the characters in this book do not speak like real human beings speak, and they don't speak, it's not like a historical fiction thing, because this is set in the 1920s. They don't speak like characters, like people from the 1920s would speak either. Like, there's zero slang. I mean, I think they just don't use contractions, because I think the author thinks it makes them sound older and more formal, but it just sounds awkward, it just sounds flat. And then there's also a real lack of consistency in this writing. Like, the big problem is that characters will leave, like, it'll be like the characters will leave in the middle of a scene, and then a page later they'll still be in the conversation speaking, and you'll be like, you left the room. Why are you still here? Did you teleport back in? And then chapters will end what feels like very abruptly, like in the middle of a scene, in the middle of a conversation, and then the next chapter will open with the characters halfway across town doing something completely different, and you'll be like, how did that conversation end? How did they get here? Where are we? What's going on? Oh, while the main characters are interesting and feel well developed, the side characters are all just bland and there. So it was just a lot of stuff that came together to make this novel very obviously a debut novel, first effort. Like, there's a lot of really interesting good stuff here, but it's just not built on enough. I really like the family dynamics in this book and the relationship between the two main characters, Layla and Elise, although I wanted the enemies part of this, like, enemies to lovers story to be drawn out more. Like, I just don't know where they're gonna go by the end of this book, because their relationship is done, it's developed, it's enough. So I just don't know where the author's gonna go from here. But I also really liked the social commentary around the vampires, using them to talk about anti-Black racism and the unethical human experimentation that the United States government did to Black people. It's all horrible stuff, and I found the way that it was dealt with in this novel to be quite interesting and well done. Although I don't like that the vampires in this novel are called Reapers. I never like that. I never like when they make up a name for vampires. Like, let's just call them vampires, please. So yeah, my problems with that book, again, were mostly that on a writing level, I think it just needed more editing, but I would read it more from this author, and I will probably read the sequel just to see how she's developed since the debut novel, because I think a lot of people had similar complaints. So okay, next on my disappointments list, and what I think is going to be a controversial one, my first controversial one, is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This was published in 2022. Everyone loves this book, and while I was reading it, I enjoyed it, and then the further I got into the novel, the more I started to not enjoy it, and then the longer I sat with the novel after I finished it, the less I liked it. So let's talk about that. I think Zevin's prose is really gorgeous, and the concept of this novel is really interesting, and the way it's done is super cool. I think the writing style that this was written in could easily start to feel stilted or annoying, but it never does. I thought the writing style was really awesome. The core cast of characters is very strong, a very compelling set of characters. But my big problem with this book is that the core of the novel, what Zevin wants to be the focus, is the dynamic between Sadie and Sam, who are like estranged childhood friends who end up making video games together. And they have a really complicated love friendship relationship, and they are never able to really admit that they love each other. So they're the core of this book, Sadie and Sam. But I just always thought that the Sadie-Sam dynamic paled in comparison to the relationship between Sadie, Sam, and their third best friend, Marks. I don't know if it's pronounced Mark or Marks. It's spelled like Karl Marx, so that's how I'm gonna say it. And their third friend, Marks, who they meet in college. I just thought that three-way relationship was so much more interesting than just Sadie and Sam on their own. Like, Sadie and Sam are too similar. They're two similar characters and two similar people, and Marks really provided that texture and that difference, and you could see how he would like round out what they have and really bring it to the next level. That they're not the focus. And the insistence, Zevin's insistence on making Marks and Sam explicitly platonic / brotherly was just so annoying. Like, there are several times when other characters bring up, like, so what's going on? Like, are you guys in a weird throuple situation? Like, Marks, are you attracted to Sam? Because Marks is, like, I think canonically bisexual. And the amount of times it's just brought up just so it can be shot down is so annoying. Like, I want it to be ambiguous. I like ambiguity, I like nuance. I didn't need Marks and Sam to be canonically, romantically interested in each other, but I wanted their relationship to be treated with the same ambiguity that Sadie and Sam's is, the way that they kind of cross those boundaries and don't put up proper boundaries between romantic and platonic, because that's just more interesting, and that's the way their relationship feels like it should be. That's the way they act towards each other. But no, Marks is just kind of the awkward third wheel for a lot of this novel. And then Sadie and Marks get together and like get married, but Sam hates it because he's in love with Sadie or whatever. But the core of the story is, again, Sadie and Sam. So Zevin has to get rid of Marks somehow, and the way she does it is just so insane. I was like, it's just so melodramatic. Like, I feel so bad saying this, but honestly, the way that they get rid of Marks leaves this novel, and the way that they do that is so out there and melodramatic that it's supposed to be this really serious, sad moment, but I just couldn't take it seriously, especially because when they're like, Marks gets shot by a teenager in his own office, goes into a coma where he can hear everything around him but he can't move, while Sadie is pregnant with his baby despite the fact that they, you know, are not married or whatever and don't want to get married. And then he like has this whole scene where they say goodbye and they take him off of life support and he like is dying basically. And one of the characters, like, they say some bizarre gamer metaphor during this moment that literally just made me like nervously laugh because I'm like, not the time. So again, this scene is supposed to be like really touching and like sad, and like it is sad because my favorite character was dying, but also I was like, for me it would have been like better and more realistic if he had just like gotten sick or like been hit by a car one day. Like, I just don't, that's when like the melodrama of the book really just came to its peak and made you realize how unrealistic and melodramatic this book is, and it kind of just really not soured it for me, but I just couldn't take the book seriously after that. And then after Marks is gone, again, it's that interesting dynamic that I was rooting for is gone, and it's just Sam and Sadie, and they're just not interesting enough on their own to me to carry this novel. I also thought this book had like some really weird social commentary. Like, for the most part, this book is very progressive, and like, you know, Marks is bisexual, and it talks about the misogyny Sadie faces in the game industry, and Sam is half Asian and is disabled, like he has his foot amputated, and Sam is lower class, and like, so there's a lot of like social commentary going on in this book, and a lot of it is good or fine or serviceable, but some of it was just weird. Like the commentary on cultural appropriation, like Sam and Sadie they make a video game centered around a Japanese character named Ichigo, and that's the name of their game, Ichigo, and it's about this ambiguously Japanese child character. Sadie is a white woman. Sam is not Japanese, I think he's Korean, and he's half Korean. And so there's some discussion about, is that cultural appropriation? Like, they made the game in the early 2000s, so it wasn't really an issue then, but like a lot of this book is set in like the present day, them reflecting back on their career. So some people are like, you know, do you regret like having a Japanese main character when neither of you are Japanese? Like, do you think that you accurately represented that culture, or was it offensive? Like, and the book is just not really interested in actually having those discussions about cultural appropriation. Like, I also don't think that Sam and Sadie, you know, deserve to be pillared at the stake for making a game with a Japanese main character when they're not Japanese, but also I think you could have way more interesting conversations about that. Like, did they accurately represent that? How does Sam feel that as a Korean, his greatest gift to the world is a Japanese video game? Like, I wanted more of that, and instead the whole discussion is just like, nope, some people are really mad at us for culturally appropriating, but cultural appropriation is actually good because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to make our video game. And I'm just like, I don't know if I agree with that part. Also, despite a lot of commentary in this book being about the misogyny that Sadie faces both as a woman in the world but also specifically in the gaming industry, it kind of felt like there was never a conclusion to that. Like, Sadie doesn't make female friends in the gaming industry. She basically has zero female friends, by the way, besides a like fetishized threesome between her and Marks's then girlfriend. Sadie never like meets other women in the industry, never becomes like a driving force for hiring women in the industry, like never speaks at women-centric events. Like, there's just, it's just kind of this thing that's presented like, and Sadie had such a hard time because she's a woman in a male-dominated industry, but like no actual discussion on what we can do to mitigate that, or what we can do to change that, or even like the real struggles that she faces because of that. Like, it's just there. But then the thing that just like really bothered me was that Sadie has this relationship in college with a professor who's like this big name in the gaming industry. So he essentially, like, he's her professor and someone she really looks up to, and they enter into a sexual and romantic relationship. He's cheating on his wife with her, mind you, he's cheating on his wife with her. And the relationship is really mentally and physically abusive. He doesn't hit her, but he engages in sexual behaviors that she is maybe not 100% on board with the violence of them. Like, they do BDSM that she's like just not into, and he ends up like really physically hurting her during this sex, and she's like not into it, and he once leaves her like handcuffed to the bed for like hours when she doesn't want to be. And so it's just like really harrowing to read that and read the abuse he does to her, and then have the conclusion of that be that they just both get over it and remain friends. And it's not, maybe I'm misremembering it because frankly, I read this book like a couple weeks ago, but honestly, I just don't remember the specifics of this. I just remember being very angry over it. There's never like a conversation where Sadie is like, you know, the way you treated me was wrong. I think he apologizes to her, but it's a very brief, like brushed off apology. and then they just are like platonic besties for the rest of their lives, and she stays in closer contact with him than she does with Sam after Marcus's death, and that just really bothered me. I just could never get behind that, the idea that like, no, she forgave him and they've remained friends. Also, he's Israeli, and I just, in this political climate, it was just really uncomfortable reading about him having a wife in Israel and going back to live in Israel, and none of the other characters like address that at all. Like, I didn't need Gabrielle Zevin to address Israel's genocide of Palestinians, but like, you're telling me you have all this other room for social discussion in this book, but not a single word about the fact that Dov is Israeli. It doesn't bother anyone else. No one ever wants to talk about it. Okay. So yeah, this book got a lot of raw emotion out of me. Like, I cried several times reading this book, but raw emotion is not enough for me. Like, I need the actual book to be well constructed. I don't need it to just succeed in getting emotion out of me. I need it to actually be a good book, and I just don't think this was. Next on my disappointing list is Nightbitch by Rachel Yoder, which was published in 2021. This is a story about a mom who starts turning into a dog and like all the stuff that happens around that. This is a really fun concept. I read this because I saw the trailer for the movie and I kind of wanted to see the movie, which I haven't yet, and I knew it was based on a book. This concept is fun, but it's just a concept that I don't think you can stretch out into like a 250-page book. Like, this should not have been more than a short story or a novella. There's just not enough there. And the way it's done, there's especially not enough there because there's just like so little going on in this story. And I wasn't enjoying this at first, and then I started to enjoy it when it gets really weird, but then by the end I just wasn't enjoying it anymore because I didn't think it came together thematically. The themes of this book, it just has nothing new or interesting to say about motherhood or about domestic labor and the gender divisions of labor. It's all very surface level, and when it's not surface level, it's going into the like feminine divine energy shit that I hate, so it just had nothing interesting to say to me. I also just thought it was weird that this is told from the perspective of a mom who's like already very feminist and already very aware of like the patriarchy and how that affects her and how those gender divisions of labor are unfair, because it just makes the whole, she has nowhere to go, she has nowhere to grow. It's just the physical thing that's happening to her. So I thought it would have been much better if this story had been from the perspective of like one of the yoga moms she meets in this book who are in like a multi-level marketing cult who like starts off, you know, very happy and secure in her motherhood and like just doing it, and then slowly as she starts to turn into a dog, starts to come to terms with feminism and the patriarchy. Like, I just don't know why she chose to have such a static character. I don't know if I would read more from this author just because I just don't read a lot of like literary fiction horror, but this wasn't the worst story I've ever read in the world, but it just like also wasn't the best. And so the most disappointing book I read in 2024 is actually two books. It's Ancillary Sword, which was published in 2014, and Ancillary Mercy, which was published in 2015 by Ann Leckie. This is also, I think, a hot take. I read Ancillary Justice in 2023, and I actually really enjoyed that one. I thought that book has really strong characters and a really strong plot. It's like about this ancillary who is like a smaller piece of a big ship. She's like the ship's AI, but she can put her consciousness into the little people and send them off. And it's about an ancillary whose ship has been destroyed, and she is kind of trying to get revenge on the people who blew up her ship and the crew on it. And we flash back and forth between her in the present executing her revenge plot and her in the past, the events leading up to her like betrayal and what happened to her. And it's a great setting. We're on like a snow planet for a lot of it, which I love. I love snow exploration type stuff. You might be able to see the Left Hand of Darkness behind me. And the plot is really strong. It's a very driving plot, and the plot is very much driven by Breck's revenge quest. Breck has really strong motivations, and Sevardin, who is part of this quest in a way I can't remember, honestly. I don't remember this book that much, the actual plot machinations, but I just remember thinking they were well done and thinking Sevardin was really interesting. And the world building of this series is also really interesting at first. It takes place in this like galactic empire where it's called the Imperial Radch, I think is how you say it, Radch, I don't know, it's a fantasy word. This empire has an emperor who is basically immortal. She just continues to transfer her consciousness into new bodies, and they annex other worlds and have created this big empire. And the empire is really interesting. They don't have gender, they all go by she her pronouns, and so the kind of commentary around gender and how Breck is really confused by other cultures who have gender is really interesting. And they love tea, which started to really grate on me by the end, but anyways, interesting world, great characters, great plot for Ancillary Justice. And then in 2024, I read second and third book in this trilogy, and I was really disappointed by them. I thought they were not as good as Ancillary Justice, and in fact, quite bad, like a big step back. And I don't know if that's just because I took such a long break in between reading these two books, and Ancillary Justice was like one of the first sci-fi books I really read, and then in between that I got really into sci-fi and have read a bunch of really great sci-fi books, especially books with like a similar concept. And so I don't know if I went back and reread Ancillary Justice I would still like it, but I think so. Like, I remember that book just being well done, whereas these two books I just did not think were well done. I found the series just to be hamstrung by its lack of overall conflict. Like, after that first book where Breck is so strongly driven by her revenge quest, there kind of is no central conflict, especially for Breck. It's vaguely about the Imperial Radch civil war. Like, two of the facets of the Emperor have to like split and started fighting, and Breck is nominally working for one of them, but she doesn't actually care, and she really doesn't want to be involved in the civil war. She doesn't want to take sides. She doesn't care about either one of them. So it's kind of like Breck doesn't have a personal stake. She doesn't have a personal motivation here. And there also is a real lack of interpersonal relationships or conflict between characters, which just makes the rest of the series feel quite meandering. Like, the second book is so plotless. The second book is a lot of just people standing around talking, and not even like interesting talking. I love books where people stand around and talk, but I like when they stand around and talk in service of a greater like political conspiracy or plot, and that just wasn't happening in the second book in this series. The third book is better paced, but still there's just like such a lack of overall plot. I don't know what this series is supposed to be about. The main kind of focus of this series in the later two books is Breck's struggle with personhood and with being her own person and coming to terms with the fact that she has been split off from her ship, and that like the humans treat the AI badly, that the AI should be like a separate species because they are sentient and they have feelings, and right now they're just being treated as servants, mindless servants. But Breck is not a mindless servant. She clearly has personality and wants and needs and individualism, and she struggles with that for very little time, honestly. She is completely done struggling with it. She has completely come to terms with her own self and her identity by like the 30% mark of the last book in this trilogy. So we still have like 70% of the book where we don't have an external plot and we don't have an internal character focused conflict. So it's just very meandering, and there's this outside plot going on that just feels, again, Breck feels so disconnected from because she does not have a personal stake in that plot. And the Radch civil war is kind of never shown in this book. Like, we're told that the two factions are warring, but again, because Breck doesn't really care, we don't see the end to this conflict. We don't really know which one wins. Breck doesn't really care which one wins. There's never like an action or battle scene, which I don't need a lot of action, but just like, I need something, and you just don't get any of that. The big thing of this series for me was, again, the way that there was just no conflict either between characters or internally. Breck is able to solve any problem with one conversation. She's able to walk into a room, pinpoint the underlying issue there, and solve centuries of systemic oppression with like one conversation, and it just always ended up feeling preachy and boring. All the characters in this book talk in the exact same way. They all talk in this very flat, sanitized, overly emotionally intelligent way. Everyone knows exactly what they're feeling, when they're feeling, and how to fix it, except for the alien translator, who is like, if millennial cringe was a person, like the translator is supposed to be very quirky and like fish out of water, but I just found their energy exhausting and not fun and exciting. So it was just a lot of characters I didn't care about talking in a way I didn't care about, doing things I didn't care about. And I think this is because Breck collects side characters like their RPG companions. Like, lovable new side characters are shuffled on and off page so quickly that like it's kind of impossible for any of them to get any real attention or real character development, and so I just ended up caring about none of them. There's a huge chunk of page time dedicated to like the two kind of central side characters, Sevardin and Ekalu, and it's just awful. I hated this conflict, and I hated kind of the discussions around it because, again, it felt very sanitized and flat and overly emotionally intelligent and very preachy. I wrote a whole review about this series, and you can read that if you want more detail because I just don't want to go into it right now, but the central conflict of the second two books in this series is whether or not Breck is a person. If Breck is a person, then does that mean that all AI are people, and do they deserve the same rights as humans? And like, obviously the answer is yes. I think maybe if we got more examples of AI in this book that were either evil or like not at the same level of sentience that Breck was, then maybe that question would be more interesting. But like, Breck is obviously a person, and all the other AI are obviously people and deserve equal rights or whatever. So it's just never a really interesting conflict or question. But even then, the solution to that, the answer to that, is just to hand it off to to the Prester, this other alien species who kind of act as like galaxy peacekeepers, I guess. They just hand the question over to them and are like, I guess the Prester will figure it out. They're gonna figure it out. And what they decide, we'll go with. Off page and at an unspecified future date. So we don't get to see any of the ramifications of Breck deciding she's a person, or Breck deciding that AI are people, or Breck trying to create like an AI-free state, basically. We don't get to see any of that. And I know there's a sequel series to this, but like that is the central conflict of this series. I want to at least see growth and development of that theme happen in this series. I don't want to have to read a whole other series to see these questions wrapped up. I like ambiguity. I like not every question getting answered, but like there's not answering every question and leaving plot threads up to answer in a later series, and then there's just like not doing anything at all. And that's what I felt like this book was doing. And again, people love the world building in this book, and I liked it in Ancillary Justice, but like I just think it doesn't end up really developing beyond what we see in Ancillary Justice. All we know about the Radch is that they don't have gender, they use she pronouns, they love tea, and they eat fish sauce. That's not a culture, that's a collection of quirky things that are brought up over and over again until they feel like a parody of themselves in the last book. But anyways, that's me being a hater. Sorry, I'll stop. I think if I hadn't read a bunch of other sci-fi series that were in a very similar vein, like analyzing the relationship between colonizers and the people they oppress, queer normative, interesting world building, set in space, if I hadn't read any other book like that, then maybe I would like this more and maybe I would think it was more unique and interesting. But I have read books, other sci-fi books in that same vein, and I've really liked them, and I thought they did this same concept much better. I just didn't see anything in this series that I was getting that I wasn't getting better from other books. I think if you really like Ancillary Justice and the rest of the series, I really recommend A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine and Nine Fox Gambit by Yoon-Ha Lee. Those are both series that I thought kind of did similar things but better in my opinion. Okay, now we're moving on to the top 5, which are going to be, again, worst books that I actually thought were straight up bad, as opposed to just books that I did not like. So let's get into it. The first book on my worst books list is A Dowry of Blood by St. Gibson, which was published in 2021. This is kind of a retelling of Dracula's Wives, and again, this is a hot take because this is a very beloved book, but I just didn't like it. I'm sorry. I knew the second I opened up this book that I wasn't gonna like it because it's told in a writing style that just does not appeal to me. I don't like overly flowery prose. I don't like the kind of vibes that this book is putting down with this prose, but I also just thought on a construction level it was not great. The book is told with this framing narrative of the main character Constanta writing a letter or like reflecting or talking to Dracula's dead body about their relationship in the past. And Constanta has already come to terms with the fact that Dracula was abusive and treated her badly. So what's the point of this letter? What's the point of this narrative? She already knows. She already knows and has already kind of healed from everything Dracula did to her. So it just, again, is about a very flat and static character. Like, we see her growth in the past, but again, she doesn't really grow in the past. She just is kind of abused and then talks to us about how it was abusive. And that was also something that I struggled with. I think this could be a very touching and impactful story about abuse recovery, but for me, any interesting things that it was doing was kind of taken away from the fact that it is so explicit. Like, every time Dracula does something abusive, instead of just letting the audience see it and hold space, I don't want to say hold space with that.
I didn't know that was happening.
I've seen it, yeah.
Every time Dracula does something abusive, instead of just letting the audience see that and know that it was abusive and react to that, or even slowly come to terms with the fact that he is abusive like Constanta does in the past, Constanta in the present has to butt in and be like, and you did this to me and that was horrible and that was abusive and here's all the reasons why, you know, I would never let you do that to me now. And it's like, you don't need to say that. Show it to us, don't tell it to us. I felt like this book really struggled with telling versus showing. Also, this book does one of my least favorite vampire things where the main vampire character only feeds on evil people. I just hate this, especially because this book wants to be very dark and gothic and morally gray, and yet it can't accept the fact that vampires have to kill people to live, and sometimes that means they're going to kill people who don't deserve it. First of all, I know this is a fantasy about vampires, but for me, I just can never stop thinking about the fact that small towns, like the towns that she's hiding out in this book, do not have a never-ending supply of bad people. There's not a never-ending supply of criminals and rapists and abusers for Constanta to feed on. Like, realistically, how many people like that can there be in like a small town of like 40 people? Like, even if every person in this town is evil, you're gonna run out of people eventually. It really removes that internal conflict between am I evil for needing to feed on other people to survive or not? Because you can just feed on bad people. Easy. Constanta never has to grapple with choosing whether or not to put her own survival before anyone else's, because every time she drinks from innocent people, it's just Dracula forcing her. I just find that boring. Why do vampires if you're not going to do vampires? Also, this is supposed to be like a feminist novel, and Constanta also is in a relationship sort of with the other woman in the Dracula polycule, but it's honestly very secondary, and both of these women are more interested in the third guy who eventually comes into the polycule, Alexei, and they both kind of, he's at the center as opposed to Constanta being at the center and them being around her. Despite this novel being about the fact that abusive men like Dracula will be threatened by strong, independent, smart women and will slowly start to strip that away from them, like Dracula does to Constanta and Magdalena. Constanta and Magdalena's relationship and their lives end up revolving so heavily around Alexei, and I just didn't like that. I didn't like that once they kill Dracula and are free from his abuse and they kind of scatter to the ends of the earth, but then they quickly come back together for Alexei, because Alexei is lonely and he wants them to come to New York to watch him put on plays and stuff. And I just thought that was so lame that Constanta and Magdalena have to uproot their entire independent lives to go mother Alexei. And I think that this ending is like technically not canon. I think that like it's an epilogue that was added to the book when it was republished traditionally. And I just hate it. I thought it was such a bad ending and such a waste of that moral, of that feminist moral, and so contrary to those feminist themes that Magdalena and Constanta's needs are treated as ultimately less than Alexei's, and they're supposed to uproot their lives for him and not the other way around. Like, Constanta is the main character. Why are they not doing it for her? Next on this list is An Education in Malice, also by St. Gibson, published in 2024. This is a Carmilla retelling, supposedly. It is not a Carmilla retelling. The only thing it has in common is that there are vampires and the two main characters are named Carmilla and Laura. And it's funny because I think Gibson and her publishers realize that, because this book goes from being marketed as a Carmilla retelling to being marketed as merely inspired by Carmilla to completely dropping any mention of Carmilla and only being compared to A Dowry of Blood, which I think would have been better if they just stuck with that in the first place, because saying this is a Carmilla retelling brings up so many expectations, because Carmilla is such a great story and such a formative, influential vampire story, but this book just totally fails to live up to that in any way and does not engage with Carmilla's themes at all, because Carmilla is all about Carmilla the vampire and her seducing Laura, the human woman. Such a great story. I wrote a review about it, I'll link that below. But Carmilla is ultimately about this like Victorian fear of women's sexuality, especially lesbian sexuality, and about Carmilla is like this predator. She only feeds on women, and when she feeds on noble women, she goes and like seduces them and gets into their lives and makes them care about her and cares about them too. Like it's stated that she genuinely cares about Laura and the other women that she has killed, and so it's a cautionary tale. And Laura, at the end of Carmilla, still is in love with Carmilla. She has never married. She's like a woman in her 20s, which, you know, wouldn't be weird in our time, but in that time it was like, oh my god, this old spinster. And she never marries because she's still kind of waiting for Carmilla to walk into the room even after she's gone. I just didn't understand why An Education in Malice made Carmilla one of the most famous lesbian vampires. She's a predator, she's dominant, into a bisexual submissive. This is also marketed as like a dark academia retelling set in the 60s, and I just didn't think that was done super well either. Laura never goes to any other classes beyond like the poetry class she shares with Laura. Like, she mentions having finals at a certain point, but we never really learn what other classes she's taking, what's really going on this campus, anything more than Carmilla and the poetry professor that they both have. And it's like every couple chapters this book remembers it's supposed to be set in the 60s, and so a side character will just come in and be like, come on Laura, we're gonna go listen to a Jimi Hendrix CD and protest the Vietnam War. And it's like, speaking of their poetry professor, a large part of this book centers around Professor De La Fontaine. She is in the original Carmilla, she's like Laura's nurse, she's so irrelevant, but in this book she's their poetry professor that they both really look up to. She's also a vampire. The book tries to do this bait and switch thing. So at the beginning of the novel you think it's quite obvious that De La Fontaine is like grooming Carmilla and is like in a relationship with her. Then it's revealed like, aha, no, they're not fucking. De La Fontaine is just feeding off of her. Carmilla knows she's a vampire and is letting her feed off of her. It's expressed that, you know, it's not weird because Carmilla's 20 and De La Fontaine has never tried to kiss her or anything, so as long as she doesn't cross that one line, it's fine, right? De La Fontaine is still clearly grooming Carmilla and Laura. She has an immense amount of power over them, not only as like an immortal vampire, but also as their professor. She berates and harasses them in class, she love bombs them, and then withholds affection until they do what she wants. Once Carmilla turns into a vampire too, she straight up locks Carmilla up and does not let her out of the house. And it is so weird because despite all that, Gibson is really obsessed with De La Fontaine and like thinks she's the most interesting character in the novel and like wants it to be almost like a throuple dynamic, but it's just not. And I think this would be more interesting if it really leaned into that and was like a weird gothic fucked up love story between Laura, aka Carmilla in this book, and Carmilla, aka De La Fontaine, like this weird dynamic where De La Fontaine is grooming her or going after her, but there is this like genuine love and affection between them, and then the vampirism like changes everything. But she couldn't commit, and I don't know why. De La Fontaine is obviously bad and doing bad things, and yet the book wants so badly for her to secretly be a good guy and for her, you know, all of her behavior to be explained away and be permissible, and she can't just commit to having a vampire be a bad person. She has to secretly be good and secretly, you know, be on their side. De La Fontaine just suddenly decides at the end of the novel to be on their side and that she has acted wrongly, and then instead of, you know, having a scene where they get upset at her for literally kidnapping Carmilla and trying to feed her to her ex-girlfriend, they're just all okay with it, I guess, and they stay friends and they stay friendly, and it's just bizarre. I just didn't like anything about this book, and I didn't love A Dowry of Blood, but I didn't think it was super badly written. I thought the relationships between the characters were really interesting and well done, and again, while the prose wasn't for me, I thought it was fine prose, finely written, but this book just felt bad on every level. So next up on my worst books list is A Gathering of Shadows by V.E. Schwab, which was published in 2016. This might also be a hot take, I don't know. This is the sequel to A Darker Shade of Magic, which was published in 2015, and I actually thought that novel was fine. I liked it well enough. It wasn't anything mind-blowing, but I thought it was a good start to a fantasy series. It had interesting characters, interesting relationships between characters, interesting world building, and a serviceable plot. I felt like we could go in a really interesting direction from the first book. And then the second book just did not go into an interesting direction at all. It was just a lot more of the same. It felt like narratively treading water for like 450 pages because this book is so long and yet nothing happens. This is major second book syndrome. It's a lot of setup, a lot of treading water so that we can set up a cliffhanger at the very end of the novel and go into the climax of this series on a high note. For me, that setup was not interesting and was not good enough to even want to continue on with the series. I won't be finishing it. It's just 400 pages of setup for 50 pages of action with no real character growth or character change. The characters at the end of this book are at the exact same place that they were at the end of the last book. They just kind of had to do a soft reset in between books so that there was somewhere for them to go in this book without actually going anywhere. I know this is a hot take. I don't like trials. I don't like trials in books. I don't like games. I think it's because I read The Hunger Games when I was too young. They're just done so well in that book that I think nothing could ever compare for me. I don't care for trials, especially because the trials in this book, the games, the element games is what they're called, are so boring. Like, there's so much fuss about them, and then they end up again only being like 50 pages and just like they're not even magic. They're just like a free-for-all battle royale and then one-on-one matches for like the top 12 winners of that. I also thought that the prose in this book was like noticeably worse than the prose in the first book, which is like fine YA prose, like very bantery, almost too bantery, like you're like no human being actually talks to each other like that, but fine prose, serviceable prose. You don't notice it, it just carries you along. Whereas the prose in this book, I noticed, and like not in a good way, not in a wow that's well written way. It just felt like a lot of repeated information over and over again, and V.E. Schwab does my pet peeve, which is when an author writes a sentence and then enter, repeats that sentence but in italics to emphasize it. It is the most annoying thing in the world to me because it feels so repetitive and because it feels so unnecessary. Like, if that sentence is so important, italicize it the first time or find a different way to say it that still conveys the fact that it's being emphasized, that information is important. It literally just feels like Schwab is trying to reach word count, because sometimes she will do that same thing but will repeat a sentence like 3 times, and I'm like, I get it. I also think that the characters are much less interesting in this book, weirdly, despite, like I said, them having like the same arcs that they have in book 1, but like it starts to be boring because you're like, where are they going? Where are they gonna go from this? Kel should be my type of character. I've told you, I love pathetic male characters. Kel ticks off all these boxes. He's pathetic, he's dedicated to his family, he's guarding his brother, he is like a special meow meow. He has this special kind of magic that nobody else has and nobody understands how tortured it makes him. He wears a funny coat. Like, that is perfect. I love characters like that. He's kind of almost, he reminds me a little bit of Nicholas in Death of the Necromancer, which was like one of my favorite books of 2024. And yet Kel is just so fucking boring. I don't care for him, and I don't even hate him. Like, at least if I hated him, I would have strong opinions about him. but I just don't care about Kel. He is not interesting. I also thought in this book, Schwab tries to open up like the world building and do more world building about this like set of Londons that we're in, and all of it ended up feeling like way worse than if she had just left it alone to me. Like, it just starts to make zero sense, and there start to be a lot of like gaping holes in the fabric of this world. Like, if you've never heard of this series, it takes place centered around London, but there's like 3 different versions of London, and they all have varying levels of magic. All 3 cities are geographically like near identical. There's the same landmarks in each city, although because of magic, like some of them are very different looking. Red and Grey London are like what we would consider London, English. It's England. White London is Norse for no reason, never explained why it's Norse, why they're Norse. They just are. They're Norse. Grey London is like what we would consider real London, like our London, normal human people. Red London is kind of our London, but with magic, with normal English humans like there are in Grey London, but also with like fantasy races, but there's only apparently like 3 countries in the whole world that London has contact with, despite this being a world in which magic is abundant and global travel should be booming. Like, it's just so confusing. Why is Red London the only one with fantasy races, and why are they fantasy races when they're identical to Grey London, which is not a fantasy realm? Why are there only 3 countries in the entire world? And then again, White London is just Norse people. Like, it makes zero sense. It makes zero sense. I think, unfortunately, I won't be reading more of V.E. Schwab because her work is like always better when she doesn't explain things. She comes up with these really great concepts and these really interesting concepts, but whatever you could imagine about that concept is always better than the actual execution she goes with. And that's just disappointing me because she has such great concepts and then she just doesn't do anything interesting with them. This was actually supposed to be the first worst book I talked about, the least worst book I talked about, but I just skipped over it, which would say a lot about how much I care about this book. This is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, which was published in 2023. I don't even feel like I need to talk about this book. Like, listen, I wasn't even going to read it just because I knew I was not going to like it and I didn't want to waste my time. There's been enough talk about how bad Fourth Wing is, or how good if you like it. Listen, I'm not trying to judge, but there are really well written pieces out there, really well filmed pieces out there explaining the criticisms about this book. I didn't need to read that. I didn't need to do that. For my friend's birthday, she really wanted me to basically hate read this book for her, and so I did. And yeah, I mean, it was just one of the worst books I read in 2023. I knew I wouldn't like it because I don't like school settings. I don't like the military. I don't like very heavy romance-focused fantasy. It was just never gonna appeal to me. So yeah, I'm just not gonna say much about it. I'm just gonna say that the plot is really fast-paced and repetitive. I hate the romance. I think giving your main character a info dump character trait so that you can world build and yet not explaining so much of your world until like the last 50 pages is so lame. Like, you don't even learn what country they're fighting until like the last 50 pages of this book. I also thought the prose is ridiculously bad in this book. Like, it's very sparse. It's that kind of like a specific brand of romance prose that is very sparse and very modern sounding, which I just don't like in fantasy books. I don't need it to be very old-fashioned, but I don't want it to sound like they're in the 2020s either. And Yaros's favorite thing to do is say shit, shit, shit to convey any kind of emotion: sadness, happiness, excitement, sorrow, hunger. Like, it's just, the amount of times I read the word shit in that novel is crazy. And I also think that Yaros's background in military romance is really obvious. I always say Fourth Wing is not a fantasy novel, it is a military romance with a fresh coat of fantasy slapped on top of it. So that's all I need to say about that. And so the last book I'm going to talk about is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which was published in 2017. This also might be a really hot take. I feel like this book is very hyped and beloved, and I avoided it for a really long time because of that fact, because I just knew I wasn't gonna like it, and I didn't want to be the one ruining the hype. But yeah, I finally read this year, and I just really did not like it. I thought the main thing for me was the writing style. Again, it is just like Fourth Wing. It is told in this very sparse, bland prose that just is so repetitive and so unsophisticated. Like, it's just a lot of the main character saying, I went this, I said this, I did this, I sat down, I was sad. Like, I also just did not like the characters in this book. It's supposed to be like this epic romance between Celia and Evelyn, but I just did not like Celia by the end of the book. I thought her extremely obvious biphobia was kind of crazy. Her obvious and unchecked biphobia was just crazy, and the way she's treated as in the right for some of the stuff she says was also not great to me. And even more so than that, I just found the relationship boring. A lot of it happens off page. A lot of it is just like them fighting and then not speaking to each other for months and then making up, and the fact that they make up shows how much they love each other, but like I just never really bought it. I just also thought that Monique, who is like kind of the POV character who is hearing about this relationship, is so boring and so nothing to this story. I think Reid tries to have Monique like kind of be a part of this narrative with this like twist revelation that Evelyn knew her dad and like did something horrible to her dad, but this twist comes so late in the book and is so like, again, weirdly melodramatic and out of place with the rest of the stuff that happens in this book that like you can't take it seriously, and it happens so late in the book that there's no time for really any real development or any real effect for it to have on Monique's character. Like she just kind of stays the same, and the prose is way too simplistic in her sections. Like at least in the Evelyn sections the prose is a little bit better because we're describing like old Hollywood and Evelyn's experiences and there's a lot going on, and so it's better in those sections. But then when we're in the present day with Monique like making her microwave dinners, like it's just so bad and it's so sad, but not in an intentional way. I thought that Evelyn herself was like an interesting character, and like the chronicling of her early life was really well done and really interesting, but then the further we get into her life, like the more it just feels like the author lost interest and we speed through the later years of her life, which I think should be the most interesting because that's when she's with Celia and taking control of her own life and picking her own creative projects and in like a insane lavender marriage four-way situation, which I loved, but we see so little of that because we go so fast in that latter half of the novel. Like this is the one time I'm gonna say I think this needed to be longer. Normally I'm saying the opposite. Normally I'm saying take 100 pages out, take 200 pages out. This fantasy novel is way too long. But with this one, I think it did need like 100 or 200 more pages just to really explore the latter half of Evelyn's life in greater detail, and then just polish the prose up and you're good. Then I would have liked it probably. Because I did read Daisy Jones and the Six by the same author, and I thought it was much better. I thought it was doing a lot of similar things that this novel is trying to do, but in a much better way. Like the more simple prose, first of all, the prose is better. I think she definitely developed her prose, but it's still pretty simple, and I think that works because Daisy Jones and the Six is told in like a interview style multimedia format. Like we're supposed to be seeing characters giving monologue like interviews to a camera, and there is technically a narrator, but we don't learn who it is until like the last half of the book, which I thought was, again, much better done. But anyways, this isn't a Daisy Jones and the Six review video, but I did read Daisy Jones and the Six and thought it was much better than this book. So I'm sad because I wanted to like this book, and it's such a, I feel like it's hailed as such like a lesbian classic, but I just didn't like it. I'm sorry. So yeah, now that I've yapped for so long, hopefully you can understand why I didn't like some of these books. I always go into a book with love in my heart, hoping I'll like it, and sometimes it just doesn't work out. Again, if you love any of these books, I would like to know. Tell me in the comments, like, sell these books to me. I would like to know if there's anything I'm missing, or if some people have the same issues but just it didn't matter as much to them, or if you know you think I'm totally wrong. Would love to hear that. And if you have any other books by these authors that you would recommend that you would think I would like, I would also love to hear that. But yeah, so thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.